have to be paid. A Foreign Office comment was only that the search for a diplomatic solution will continue. It will no doubt now... Portsmouth mourns HMS Sheffield. 30 of the destroyer's crew are still missing. The Defence Secretary says he knows nothing of a new battle in the South Atlantic. The Foreign Secretary pledges we're working tirelessly for a peaceful solution. And why the Argentine missile beat the Sheffield's defences. Good evening. It's been a day of mourning here at home, diplomatic activity here and abroad, and rumours of yet another battle at sea. But so far, according to the government, no new military action, and no signs either that a peaceful settlement is anywhere near. MPs were told that there are still 30 men missing from the destroyer HMS Sheffield. The warship is still afloat, despite reports in Whitehall last night that she'd actually been sunk. For 4 hours, her crew had fought the flames after an Argentine missile had smashed into her control room. Another victim of yesterday's action, Lieutenant Nicholas Taylor, the Harrier pilot killed in a bombing raid over the Falklands. He was 32, married 18 months ago. His father said, "I'm proud to have a son who died doing a job he loved for the country he loved." Buckingham Palace say the Queen has been following events in the South Atlantic closely and is deeply concerned and saddened at the loss of life. But Britain still says there'll be no ceasefire until Argentine forces are withdrawn from the Falklands. The inner cabinet met this morning, and then there was an emergency meeting of the full cabinet. Later, the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Pym, spoke in the House of Commons. He commented on the various moves to find a diplomatic solution, and he made this pledge.
I can assure the House that any obstructionism there may be will not come from our side. Although it is we who have been the victims of aggression, it is also we who are working tirelessly and constructively for a peaceful solution.
Mr. Pym was talking to a House of Commons more subdued than it's been since the crisis over the Falklands developed nearly 5 weeks ago. And Portsmouth, home base for HMS Sheffield, was a city in mourning. Francis Coverdale has been there.
The local newspaper called it the city of anguish, and certainly the people of Portsmouth haven't known anything like it since the Second World War. The atmosphere today was in stark contrast to that of 30 days ago when the first of the task force ships sailed out. Today was the day the reality of the conflict in the South Atlantic came home. The reaction was naturally one of shock.
Well, I got a few mates on there and everything, and I remember how they are, but it's very disheartening, and, well, I can't really say much more. Shocked us all.
I think it's terrible. I mean, who would have thought it came to this, and to hear a ship go down, one of ours as well, when it is bad.
Was it that much of a shock?
It was to me, yes. I didn't think it would end up with one of ours actually being sunk.
Inside HMS Nelson, an information centre is handling the hundreds of inquiries from relatives of the men who served on HMS Sheffield. The first many of them knew about the tragedy was from the television. Then, for wives, like those of Chief Petty Officers John Batting and Mike Smith, there were several hours before the news came through that their husbands were safe. It was an agonising wait.
Just wanting to know, really just wanting to know if he was one of the casualties, or if he was safe. That's all you can think about, hearing about your husband.
How did you pass the time?
Gallons of tea, cigarettes, cleaning the bath out, doing all sorts of things, just walking up and down.
You didn't sit still all night, did you?
No.
Up and down all night, making sandwiches.
I just had to keep busy so that I didn't think about it. I just felt that if I stopped and thought about it, then I would just go to pieces, and the children were up and they were watching me, and I felt that if I broke down in front of them, then, they would be really, feel terrible. And I just sort of kept myself going.
So when did you finally hear that your husband had been picked up?
Well, I heard at 4:30.
And I heard at 2, which made it worse really, because we had 2.5 hours of waiting to hear about John.
Yes.
But for many in Portsmouth it wasn't good news, and on married quarters estates around the city there was a heavy and depressing air. The families of the dead and injured are all receiving personal visits. In a community as close as this, their grief is a common one.
The Defence Secretary has given the Commons details of the destruction of HMS Sheffield. Mr. Nott said the destroyer was attacked in the middle of the afternoon, about 70 miles off the main Falkland Islands, and she was hit amidships. The officers and crew were helped by firefighting teams from other vessels before the order was finally given to abandon ship. Our defence correspondent, Christopher Wayne, looks at how the Sheffield was attacked by an Argentine plane and why their missile beat the destroyer's defences.
The Super Étendard aircraft which attacked HMS Sheffield are identical to those in service with the French Navy. They're so new the Argentines haven't had time to adapt them for service in the carrier Vienticinco de Mayo. So they were land-based and operating at the limits of their range when they found HMS Sheffield. She had been acting as a radar picket for the task force to give early warning of Argentine air raids. The Shiny Chef, as she was known, was a big destroyer, 3,500 tons and 400 feet long. But in naval terms, she was under-equipped. She carried only one Lynx helicopter, only one 4.5-inch gun, and only one missile system, the Sea Dart, which is intended to be able to hit other warships out of sight over the horizon, or, more importantly, attacking aircraft. So Sea Dart should have been able to deal with the Argentine Super Étendard naval strike planes as they approached Sheffield yesterday. But it's possible either that the aircraft weren't detected or that they simply weren't in range. But the Sheffield was in range of Exocet, a missile which is designed to skim along the surface along a rough bearing until its radar picks up the target and it's able to home in precisely. It has a devastating impact when it strikes the target. The sort of damage sustained by Sheffield can be judged from this photograph, which shows an old British frigate which was used as a target for Exocet. If this ship had been underway in heavy seas, she couldn't have remained afloat. The loss of Sheffield might have been avoided if she'd been provided with Seawolf missiles. These are so accurate they can hit artillery shells in mid-air. But Type 42s don't have Seawolf. Money is limited, and it would have cost a great deal to provide, though not as much as replacing a warship.
Both the Defence Secretary and the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Pym, reported to the House of Commons this afternoon. MPs were anxious for news of the casualties on the Sheffield and of new diplomatic initiatives to settle the dispute before any more lives are lost. But neither minister was giving much away. As our chief political correspondent Brian Curtoys reports, MPs were anxious above all that a peaceful solution should be found.
The impact of the attack on HMS Sheffield, which caused so much tension and anxiety in the Commons late last night, today produced a more sober, subdued mood among MPs. There seemed to be a conscious effort to create party unity, and the accent was very much on the need to find a diplomatic settlement, even if MPs don't have a great deal of hope. After the serious conflict of the last 2 days, the government were concentrating all their efforts on reassuring international opinion that they were intent on finding a solution. In other words, it was Diplomacy Day. The need for this was stressed by Labour's Foreign Affairs spokesman Dennis Healey.
I think we all feel that if military escalation continues in the way it has over the last 2 days, then more lives could be lost, both Argentine and British, than there are inhabitants on the Falkland Islands. And that does underline the paramount necessity, if I may use that expression, of achieving a diplomatic solution.
Mr. Pym made his statement after attending meetings of the Inner Cabinet and the Cabinet, where it said he has a lot of support for his emphasis on diplomacy. The Cabinet had examined the two current peace initiatives, the United Nations moves and those involving the Peruvians and Mr. Hague. Mr. Pym told MPs something about these discussions.
I want to tell the House that a vital ingredient of the ideas on which we are working is an early ceasefire and the prompt withdrawal of Argentine forces. I can assure the House that we are sparing no efforts in the search for an acceptable solution in line with the principles which we have stated on several occasions. The points which were put to me in New York by the Secretary General of the United Nations are also receiving our very careful attention.
Some MPs detect signs of flexibility in Mr. Pym's approach over negotiating a ceasefire and an Argentine withdrawal. Later, Mr. Pym accepted the suggestion from Dr. David Owen for the Social Democrats that United Nations trusteeship for the Falklands in the long term was a possibility. It might, he said, be highly suitable. But to a Conservative, he was unenthusiastic about any thought of having to bomb Argentine mainland bases. Today, Mr. Pym carried the House of Commons with him, with his undertaking to work tirelessly and constructively for a peaceful solution. But changing events in the South Atlantic mean that MPs are in a volatile mood.
Diplomatic efforts continue in Europe, where the European Parliament is to debate the Falklands conflict amidst indications that some common market countries are not prepared to continue to support Britain unequivocally. But the focus of attention is again on the United States, where the White House appealed for a quick end to the fighting. Secretary of State Alexander Haig is working with the Peruvian president and with the Spanish foreign minister to find a way to open negotiations. At the United Nations, too, strenuous efforts are being made to find a way out of the impasse. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, Keith Graves.
The government is going to great pains to stress the continuation of the diplomatic process, but there are no signs that diplomacy is going to end this crisis. Rather, that there's a growing concern that support for Britain will be eroded unless the diplomatic channels are seen to be open. Foreign Office officials have been playing down the possibility of a split in the EEC front, but tonight West Germany made another urgent appeal for a ceasefire, calling the situation critical and dangerous. What diplomatic hope there is seems to rest on a Peruvian plan being backed by the United States. It involves, amongst other things, a ceasefire, and a Foreign Office spokesman said today, "We hope these contacts may lead to early progress," which had everyone pricking their ears up until he added, "There's no hope of a negotiated settlement unless the pressures, diplomatic, economic and military, are maintained." Although the Foreign Office won't confirm it, it appears that American Secretary of State Haig suggested to Britain an unconditional 48-hour ceasefire before, as the State Department put it, things really get out of hand. But Britain's line is no ceasefire without withdrawal of Argentine troops from the islands and unprejudiced negotiations about their future. And on those crucial points, London and Buenos Aires are as far apart as ever. The United Nations Secretary-General is still in the diplomatic field with a list of ideas being considered in London and Buenos Aires. But the UN's involvement seems likely to be a long-term thing rather than having any immediate effect on the worsening situation. Washington, in fact, is still the clearinghouse for ideas to end the crisis. From there, Martin Bell.
A sign of the urgency being felt here, Mr. Haig was on his way to a routine diplomatic event in New York when the bags were unpacked from his plane and he turned round unexpectedly for a 2.5-hour meeting with the British ambassador. The British were giving their answer, and they called it a constructive one, to the Peruvian plan. Their ambassador, Sir Nicholas Henderson, was also given some further American ideas. The British are viewing these comings and goings as positive developments, but here too, they are insisting there can be no change in the demand for Argentine withdrawal before negotiations under any plan. The Secretary of State has shelved all other business in a frantic search for a diplomatic settlement on the Falkland Islands before there is further loss of life there. And all the signs are that he is as actively involved now as he was when he was shuttling personally between London and Buenos Aires. The difference now being that American proposals are flying essentially under another flag. And Mr. Haig, instead of being an intermediary, is looking for intermediaries wherever he can find them. The Spanish Foreign Minister, Mr. Pérez Lloca, is among those mentioned, for of the European countries, Spain has the closest ties to Argentina. He went to the State Department for a long-scheduled visit, given new importance by the crisis in the South Atlantic.
As you know, Spain has a very special interest in this crisis, and our discussions today brought forth some very helpful and important ideas from my colleague, which I hope will serve to assist in the political resolution of the crisis.
Mr. Secretary, could we ask you whether as a top priority the United States is now pushing for a ceasefire in the Falkland crisis?
I think this is a very sensitive period in the crisis, and it serves no purpose for me to engage in public speculation about the situation other than to underline once again the support of President Reagan for a political solution to this crisis, and as early as possible.
Turning to leave, Mr. Haig was asked if there was already a ceasefire. His answer, not at all.
In Argentina, some 800 survivors have now been picked up after Sunday's sinking of the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano. 150 received an emotional welcome when they were flown back to the mainland. But naval sources there have not revealed how many were lost or injured when their ship was torpedoed. Reporting from Buenos Aires on reaction to yesterday's missile attack on HMS Sheffield, here's Christopher Morris.
The crippling of the Sheffield is described here as a big morale booster for the Argentine forces. But after the loss of their own cruiser, the General Belgrano, just 24 hours earlier, there's no real sense of gloating. It's felt the score has been even, but at the same time, the prospects of any cessation of hostilities are further away than ever before. The military authorities here claim that Britain will be surprised that Argentina even had the capability of firing the type of Exocet missile which hit the Sheffield's control room. Only a few of the air-to-sea missiles had been delivered by France before the Falkland Islands blockade, and Argentine technicians had had little time to fit and test them on the Super Étendard aircraft which attacked the British destroyer. Argentine newspapers today described the Super Étendard as the avenger of the Belgrano, the attack on the Sheffield as a devastating blow to the enemy. A communique by the military junta referring to the sinking of the Sheffield said it was a response to the bombing of the island's airport, and a photograph just released following Saturday's first raid by a Vulcan bomber purports to show only minimal damage, though the runway is not shown. As anti-British feeling grows in Argentina, these posters are now being displayed, the text alongside the bullet-ridden Union Jack exhorting Argentines to fight to the death over the islands, with an apology in English. Television programs on the state-run networks were interrupted to break the news of the crippling of HMS Sheffield, based on the announcement from London. It was some hours before the military junta gave its version of the Argentine attack, with television now stepping up a propaganda campaign. Later today, survivors from the torpedoed Argentine cruiser, seen here setting off on its fateful last patrol, are due to arrive back at mainland ports aboard the rescue ships. The search still goes on for more lifeboats of the General Belgrano, which have 15 days' provisions aboard for 20 people. Amid the anger in Buenos Aires after the sinking of the Argentine warship, this was a case of the show must go on. It was all in aid of peace and sovereignty over the Falkland Islands, or Malvinas as the Argentines call them. The money raised was for Argentina's patriotic fund to help soldiers at the front line. And at times the atmosphere reflected the war fever which now grips the nation since the British submarine attack.
Tonight, all seems to be quiet around the Falklands. Admiral Woodward's carrier force is somewhere north and east, safely out of range of the Argentine Air Force. Sea Harriers are patrolling the skies, preventing any attempts to resupply the Argentine garrison by air. A screen of nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarines is preventing any Argentine surface ships from running the blockade. They'll also certainly be looking for the Argentine carrier, Cinco de Mayo, but 2 modern Argentine submarines are believed to be patrolling somewhere in the 200-mile zone, and they pose a major threat. So what happens now? It's hard to see how Admiral Woodward can possibly risk an early landing anywhere on the islands until he has control of the air and the sea, or brought the main body of the Argentine fleet to battle. The second wave of ships is known to be well to the north, and they'll stay there until it's safe to move into the battle zone. However, none of this has changed the problems facing the Argentine troops on the islands. They're still cut off from aid, they're still using up reserves of food and fuel, they still have badly wounded men needing treatment. The Falklands are still in a stranglehold. The huge resources being poured into the Falklands expedition are beginning to cause some concern in NATO. Tonight, Mr. Nott and the Chief of Defence Staff flew to Brussels for an important meeting. Kate Adie is also there.
The British government probably has a greater need for European support now that guns and missiles have been fired. Here in Brussels, after yesterday's initial cries of alarm and dismay from our European political partners, there's been a closing of ranks and a tacit decision not to rock the European boat of political support for Britain. So tonight, Mr. Nott arrives to reassure our military allies, accompanied by Sir Terence Lewin. He's here for what would usually be a routine NATO meeting. But it's clear that talks with his American counterpart, Mr. Caspar Weinberger, take priority. Over dinner tonight in one of Brussels' more notable restaurants, Mr. Nott is both briefing his NATO colleagues on events to date and allaying some anxieties about Britain's heavy defence commitment in the South Atlantic, which, if it continues for a considerable time, may have its effect on the West's deployment of forces. However, Mr. Weinberger has said today that he detects no diminution of support for Britain's actions amongst our NATO allies, and he'll be ready to listen to any demand from Mr. Nott for aid. This will probably take the form of food, fuel and general supplies to the task force, and perhaps electronic intelligence help. But most important is the support and backing from an organisation whose very business is defence.
While the QE2 is being converted into a troop ship at Southampton, the men who'll sail on her are being prepared for action. They include a battalion of Gurkha Rifles stationed near Aldershot, who joined the Scots and Welsh Guards to form 5 Infantry Brigade. Andy Webb saw the Gurkhas in training this afternoon.
Even in normal circumstances, these men are on standby to travel anywhere at 7 days' notice. The news that they were to head for the Falklands came 2 days ago, and now they're just waiting for the ship that will take them there. In addition to their rifles, they come equipped with anti-tank weapons like this, the Carl Gustav, which Marines on South Georgia used to cripple an Argentine corvette. Training with the machine gun includes an exercise that looks like musical chairs, played all the more vigorously in the knowledge that the training may soon be put to effect. The reputation of the Gurkhas is based on legendary toughness and bravery, and perhaps the army would see it as nothing amiss if right now outsiders found them and their traditions rather frightening. As one British officer put it to me, they're the best kind of soldiers to have on your side.
Some of tonight's other news. Britain's dock workers are to postpone the national strike planned to start on Monday. Dockers' leaders said the main reason was some agreement on job guarantees, but concern over the Falklands crisis had also been an important consideration. 2 Merseyside policemen have been found not guilty of the manslaughter of a young disabled man who died during last summer's Toxteth riots. 23-year-old David Moore was struck by a police van moving across some waste ground. Police officers were trying to clear crowds after some of the worst of the rioting. Today the jury delivered not guilty verdicts without hearing the defence case. In Belfast tonight, a soldier was slightly injured when a small explosive device went off near the city centre. Some trouble had been expected on the first anniversary of the death of hunger striker Bobby Sands. Police had seized more than 3,000 milk bottles, which were being stored for use as petrol bombs. Later, several thousand people marched in West Belfast to mark the anniversary, but no serious incidents have been reported. The threat to this year's Commonwealth Games of a boycott by African and Caribbean countries now seems to have passed. At a meeting in London today, delegates from the 56 Commonwealth nations condemned apartheid and agreed to set up a subcommittee to tighten the rules on excluding those countries which have sporting links with South Africa. And the immediate row over New Zealand's rugby matches against the Springboks will not disrupt this year's games, which begin in Brisbane, Australia in the autumn. Willie Carson, the Queen's jockey, was married this morning. Then he dashed off to ride 5 races at Chester. Elaine Williams, the girl he married in a 15-minute ceremony at Chester Register Office, nursed him through injuries, including a fractured skull after a fall last year. Willie's devotion to duty paid off. He came first in one of the races.